World War II has turned the Nazis into the villains of history and the armies that managed to defeat them into heroes, but all are tinged with a cloak of lawlessness. Although the assaults, robberies and sexual crimes of the German troops against Soviet populations are known, or those of the Japanese with the terror that they caused in the massacre and massive sexual assaults in Nanking, the Red Army was not far behind in its terrible crimes against the Germans. On the other hand, American soldiers are considered the greatest war heroes in history. However, a shadow hangs over them that books and culture tried to hide at all costs. In this video we are going to reveal to you the sinister and dark face of the Allied troops who, although they liberated France from the Nazi yoke, are described by accounts of the time as cruel as the Germans. Let's start with this story. The landing in Normandy and the recovery of French territory by Allied troops is often recounted as one of the most impressive military feats of World War II. The American army was welcomed with open arms by all the villages that were happy to finally be rid of the German militias, but it seems that some American soldiers took advantage of this warm welcome. Group attacks on French women, sexual relations in public places in front of children and abuse of their position of power to subdue French citizens are some of the unforgivable crimes perpetrated by North American soldiers, convinced that French women liked to sleep repeatedly with the saving heroes. Some cases were somewhat more violent, as narrated by a testimony in which some soldiers arrived at nightfall under the influence of alcohol, forced their way into a house and tried to drag two women, mother and daughter, aged 18 and 40, upstairs. They both managed to escape, but the soldiers did not give up easily and began searching every house in the area, finally finding them in a neighbor's closet shortly before midnight. The men took them out, threw them on two beds, and the crime that the 6 soldiers finally committed would remain in the memory of these 2 women forever, unable to be erased. The American High Command had sold D-Day to its militias as an erotic adventure, since in the minds of the abusers in France, it was not about humiliating the women of an enemy or punishing a people resistant to the invader, rather this was seen as a reward. The reason for this is that the French were presented by the military magazine Stars and Stripes as a great house of prostitutes, an eroticized country whose women were beautiful, welcoming and demonstrative. These stereotypes had previously been generated among World War I veterans, whose exaggerated erotic adventures in Gallic lands were passed down from generation to generation. In another example of U.S. military propaganda, which was distributed through press reports, they tried to represent France as, quote, a huge brothel inhabited by 40 million hedonists, as could be read in Life magazine of that time. This constructed and fictitious look, in which the French were nymphomaniacs, ended up stirring up a tsunami of male lust that a mistreated and mistrustful population often saw as a second assault on their sovereignty and dignity. The American historian Mary Louise Roberts has documented numerous cases of sexual abuse in Reims, Cherbourg, Brest, Caen and Le Havre, among other locations, precisely those where the American soldiers were concentrated. In an interview published by Le Monde in July 2013, the author refers to the correspondence between Pierre Voisin, the mayor of Le Havre, and an American colonel, in which the latter explained that he continually received complaints from citizens on the issue. American militias maintained relationships almost everywhere, in parks, in abandoned buildings, and even in cemeteries, displaying limitless promiscuity. Below, we present the testimony of a German woman who was raped by Red Army troops during the capture of Berlin. This account seeks to provide a deeper understanding of the experiences lived at the end of this painful war, since there are practically no similar testimonies from French women.
People in Berlin, we make a second Moscow out of you, and the war is over, you will be glorious Russia and this. And we had women and young children, our young teenagers, jumping literally off bridges, off everything, just to kill themselves because they didn't want to be raped. And this is what I don't think ever in my life will forget.
Voisin proposed that the American army open a regulated brothel north of Le Havre, which would be inspected by the health authorities to prevent the outbreak of sexually transmitted diseases. A similar request had also been made in Cherbourg where, after a series of numerous sexual assaults, the local police had asked the Americans to adopt a system of regulated prostitution, similar to the one the Nazis had maintained at the time of the occupation of Cherbourg, France. Although the U.S. High Command was aware of the atrocities being carried out by its soldiers, in both cases the U.S. military authorities opposed creating these red zones. This refusal to admit to the outbreak of sexual violence and the lust to which the U.S. troops had seemed to give in was a direct order from the U.S. government, as it was not going to allow these mischief to tarnish the honor of its soldiers. From this last fact we can deduce that there are so few narrated testimonies of the time. Investigations by historians and journalists estimate that there were thousands of cases of violations similar to or worse than those we have pointed out, but that never came to light. This is due to two main reasons, the first being that French women did not want to report the abuse so as not to carry the stigma and guilt of having been brutally raped. The second and most important reason is related to the fact that the U.S. High Command did not want to stain the honesty of their troops. The total number of attacks in France between June 1944 and June 1945, at the hands of American soldiers, is estimated at more than 3,600. It must be recognized that the leaders of the United States militias did not completely ignore these facts, but set up a war court to try a small portion of these crimes. From June 1944 to June 1945, the North American military courts installed in French territory tried 139 soldiers for this crime, of whom 68 were sentenced to life imprisonment and 22 to death. The number may seem small, but they are official counts and cover a period of 1 year. Of course, historians maintain that many other victims never filed a complaint. Almost half of those accused of sexual assault were hanged in public by the U.S. military authorities, most of whom were black, showing a racist bias in the leadership of the Army at the time, which considered that African Americans abused women for being wilder. All of these crimes and sentences, although they were carried out officially, were not publicized at all, thus seeking to silence one of the most horrendous chapters carried out by a minority of North American liberators, the rape of hundreds of French women, many of them underage. Everything told in this video up to this moment is related to the innocent women who were sexually assaulted by the Allied troops. We have also made reference to the brothels run by the Nazis that operated in France occupied by the Third Reich. The prostitutes who worked in these brothels, who were in some way employed by the German soldiers, in many cases were collaborators with the Nazi regime, either out of convenience, in exchange for privileges, or by force, simply under threat of death. When the Allies managed to defeat the Germans and expel them from the Gallic lands, cruelty and revenge, both from the victorious army and the locals full of thirst for revenge, were going to attack these women, whom they considered accomplices of the Third Reich and traitors to their country. We leave below a stark testimony, taken at that time, regarding French prostitutes and the reprisals they suffered. Montorfil, a town in northeastern France, had just been liberated. It was the summer of 1944, the year of the landing. Accused of collaboration with the Nazis, 3 female prostitutes were tortured before being hanged. There was no evidence, no arrest had been related to them, but it was the time of the purge, in which the revenge against the collaborators was public and cruel. Another very common and ruthless punishment that was applied to this group of women arbitrarily, since there was no trial or evidence, was a form of public humiliation that consisted of shaving them off and taking them in a jeep around the town, so that the locals they could boo them and throw garbage and rotten food at them as punishment. Some 20,000 French women suffered this punishment, in which the authorities sought an escape valve that would prevent further violence once the Second War ended.
We were young, vigorous boys, and 4 years had passed since our last sexual encounter. That's why we caught any German woman who crossed our path. Sometimes 10 Soviets would rape the same girl. There weren't enough women for all of us, and besides, soon the rumor of what we were doing spread, causing people to flee. We had to settle for 12 and 13-year-old girls. When they cried, we covered their mouths with a cloth, something that seemed amusing to us. Now that the years have passed, I don't understand how I was able to do this, I who had been raised by a respectable family. The terrible words you just heard belong to a former soldier of the Soviet Union. In 1945, the Red Army swept through the city of Berlin, drowning it in a wave of death and destruction that left tens of thousands dead. The crimes of the Stalinist troops were forgotten, as historians focused for decades on the abominable crimes of Nazism and the crucial Soviet victory that ultimately destroyed the Third Reich. However, starting in 1991, with the dissolution of the communist state, declassified documents have revealed shocking information about the actions of the Soviets in the German capital. The testimonies are chilling. Looting, mass rapes, summary executions, desperate soldiers seeking revenge, and officers turning a blind eye to the suffering of German civilians. Today, in this new episode, we will tell you everything about the crimes of the Red Army during the Berlin campaign. To understand the story, we have to go back to the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Third Reich. During the brutal Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's troops penetrated the east to the city of Stalingrad, where a brutal conflict raged from September 1942 to February 1943. The siege resulted in 500,000 dead Russians and a city reduced to rubble. Despite the Germans suffering a harsh defeat, the Wehrmacht entered a retreat from which there would be no turning back. In Stalingrad, communist forces captured 90,000 Germans, including 22 high-ranking generals. Now it was the Soviets' turn to exact their long-awaited revenge. From the moment Stalin was orchestrating the counter-offensive, his troops made comments and jokes about the terrible fate that awaited the Germans. Antony Beevor, one of the historians who has extensively researched the Berlin campaign, recounts in one of his books how, after the Stalingrad conflict, a Soviet colonel walked in front of a row of German prisoners of war to provoke them. He pointed with his finger to a ruined building, then shouted at the captives, "This is what Berlin will look like soon." The communists wanted to avenge not only the destruction of their cities, but also the countless crimes of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. In addition to the expected consequences of a violent war and the previously outlined plan hunger by the Nazis, which caused the deaths of millions of Soviets, Hitler's troops had devastated entire villages, exterminating Eastern populations and massacring hundreds of thousands of Jews. Let's hear the testimony of Hugo Gutfreund, who witnessed the extermination of the village of Zlotzow in 1942. All the Jewish inhabitants were led into a forest by the SS, where the following occurred.
They had to make their own graves. They was digging graves, and they had to take off their clothes and stand on the edge of the graves, and everyone shot and fall in the grave.
These massacres became part of everyday life in the Soviet Union during the invasion. According to Nazi ideology, Russians were part of the Slavic race, inferior beings to be eradicated or subjugated by the Aryan race. At the same time, this explains why the number of rapes during Operation Barbarossa was relatively low. For Wehrmacht officers, it was unacceptable for the troops to have sexual relations with Slavs, as it could contaminate the pure blood of Germans. When communist troops marched toward Berlin, their sole purpose was to destroy everything in their path. Government propaganda encouraged them not to show mercy. This can be seen in the following slogan by official propagandist Ilya Ehrenberg: "Don't count the days, don't count the kilometers, just count the number of Germans you have killed. Exterminating them is your sacred duty. It's what the Russian homeland demands." Don't hesitate, don't give up. Kill them all. On April 20th, 1945, the Soviets bombed the capital of the Third Reich for the first time. It was no coincidence that they chose this date, as it was Adolf Hitler's birthday. In this way, they showed the Berlin population who the true masters were and made it clear that the Führer could not protect them, and that the best thing they could do was surrender. From this moment on, communist artillery did not stop firing until their enemies surrendered, resulting in the material destruction of the city. Let's see a real film footage fragment recorded during the battle where the deafening roar of Soviet gunfire can be heard. Five days later, around April 25th, the siege of Berlin was complete, and all the Germans could do was defend their city with the meager resources at their disposal. Enclosed in his bunker, Hitler ordered the repulsion of the Soviets and sacrificing every last man if necessary. The Red Army resorted to urban warfare tactics they knew perfectly well, having applied them during the siege of Stalingrad years earlier. This mode of combat involved sending units of 80 men subdivided into groups of 6 to 8 soldiers. Their mission was to venture into the streets and, with the support of field artillery, conquer the city house by house. The Germans deployed snipers and machine gun nests on balconies and rooftops of the tallest buildings. Facing the Soviets in open battle would have been madness, so they chose to ambush the tanks from above. After attacking them with a rocket launcher and shooting the men, they took cover behind the windows and tried to escape through the rubble. Why? To counter the Germans, the communists began to avoid marches through the streets. To avoid unnecessary risks, they entered a building, made sure its inhabitants surrendered, and then opened a hole in the wall to advance to the next house or apartment. They continued this procedure until each block and neighborhood was in their hands. It is not news that in almost every war, atrocious crimes are committed, and in this sense, the Red Army was no exception. Firstly, we can mention the mistreatment of prisoners of war. Historian Antony Beevor recounts an episode in which the Russians caught a young member of the SS. They sat him in front of a piano and, through gestures, indicated that he should play some music, or they would execute him. Fortunately for the boy, he had enough knowledge to improvise some melodies. However, nothing was enough for the torturers, who ordered him to continue. Tearfully, the German obeyed and kept playing for hours until, after almost a full day without eating or sleeping, he collapsed from exhaustion. While he was crying on the floor, the soldiers surrounded him and congratulated him on his good work. Then, they pointed their rifles at him and shot him at point-blank range. Beyond hundreds of cases like this, the Soviets also carried out a gigantic campaign of looting and appropriation of wealth. When they reached Germany and found the cities of the Third Reich, they noticed that despite being bombed by the Allies, they were in much better condition than the cities of the Soviet Union. After almost 20 years living under Stalin's yoke, the quality of life had deteriorated for millions of people who had become accustomed to a daily life full of misery and restrictions. When they found themselves in German territory, they decided to take advantage of the opportunity to seize anything of value: cash, jewelry, furniture, musical instruments, watches, industrial machinery, car parts, paintings, sculptures. The Soviets loaded the goods onto trains and took them back to the motherland to resell them for a little money. The crimes of the Red Army did not end there. Perhaps one of the most well-known facts is the thousands of rapes that occurred during the Battle of Berlin. As we told you at the beginning of this video, communist troops behaved with an unprecedented level of cruelty, subjecting Berlin's women to abominable abuses. It was not just about satisfying their desires. The intention of dishonoring Germany through its women was also present in the act of aggression. Let's hear the testimony of a former Soviet soldier who recalls with disgust and shame the crimes of his comrades.
И вот мой взвод собственный, все мои солдаты бросаются и насилуют немок. Когда на спасение дети, матерей пытаются спасти, их застреливают. Их расстреливают, детей. Значит, теперь на дороге стоят генералы, наблюдают это, полковники. Ну, временные, дальше ехать нельзя, была загромождена дорога. Вышли. И телефонистки мои все смеются.
One crucial aspect of this testimony is the attitude of the officers. The veteran recounts that commanders observed the troops' crimes without doing anything about it, and some even laughed. Although rapes were prohibited by law, authorities preferred to ignore the assaults to avoid turning their men against them. Some went so far as to justify it, arguing that the Red Army did not allow military brothels that existed in other armies of the time. They said that this caused the soldiers to be desperate for women, and it was understandable that they reacted this way. It was a poor attempt to excuse the criminals, but the truth is that even Stalin himself thought the same. Although the testimony we saw earlier is certainly chilling, there is nothing more terrible than hearing it from the mouth of one of the victims. Now we will listen to Lisa Slater, an administrative employee of the Wehrmacht who was sheltered with others in a basement. One day, they were intercepted by the Soviets, who made them experience hell.
Our basement to all the basements. They just took their boots and we were all bedded down. All the men in the front, the woman in the back. By then I was in my 9 months pregnancy, also close to having my child. And they kicked with the boot, Frau komm. That's the only German word maybe they knew, Frau komm. And then the person had to get up, the woman, and they didn't take her outside the basement. They put her against the wall, and they stood in line with their machine gun pointing at us and raped the woman.
Soviets usually didn't care about the age of the women. The victims could be 11-year-old girls, just as they targeted women up to 70 years old. Soldiers challenged each other to attack them, and anyone who didn't was labeled a coward lacking manliness. Therefore, participating in these crimes became a kind of initiation ritual for many young members of the Red Army, who believed they had to do this to become real men. Let's continue listening to Lisa Slater's chilling testimony. There
was a lady, she was in her 60s, and I thought that was old at that time. She had a husband in the basement with her, and I don't know why, that poor woman was almost taken every night. And one night her husband was just so frustrated, he got up and thrust forward and kept saying, no, no, please, no. And what they did, they turned around, shot him, raped her, and after they finished raping her, shot her.
It is impossible to know exactly how many were the victims of the Red Army. Nevertheless, we can affirm that after their passage through the city of Berlin, they left a trail of blood in their wake and ruined the lives of thousands of innocent people. Among them were women who were savagely raped and, in the following years, had to deal with the psychological consequences of trauma. Many became pregnant after the assaults and were marginalized by the Germans themselves, who saw them as collaborators of the communist troops just for being violated. In this way, their suffering persisted for decades, and they never managed to obtain any justice for their pains. We have reached the end of the video, but before we go, we want to hear your opinion. Do you think there is a way to achieve at least a little justice for the Berlin victims of the Soviet troops? Or is it already too late? Leave your opinion in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.